Hello, this is Jake B-Man with Golden Fox Farms. Today we're going to talk about lighting a smoker and keeping a smoker lit. About 2 weeks back, I co-hosted a field day with a commercial beekeeper in my area, a guy named Tim Hollins, who runs about 400 hives. And we dug through his hives for about 2 hours. It was interesting, informative, but nothing really outlier stood out. But afterwards, someone came up with a question of, how do you keep your smoker lit for 2 hours? And I didn't have the heart to tell them that smoker had been going for 2.5 or 3 by that point, because we get out there early and we smoke all the hives, because that keeps everybody kind of chill before your field day starts. So it's one of those things I don't even think about because I've let smokers so much, but there's a number of sticking points. What we will do is go over fire theory, how the smoker is built and how it's supposed to function, and common error points, which usually amount to fuel issues, venting issues, and how you're lighting it. Lastly, we'll examine the old-fashioned way, the more common way to light a smoker, and we'll look at how I actually light my own smoker. So let's start with fire theory. To have a fire, you actually need to assemble some parts. And in the fire service, we would use a phrase called the fire tetrahedron. A tetrahedron is just a 4-sided triangle shape, so we'll just draw this thing. You could assemble that into a little pyramid, couldn't you? You need 4 different things to actually have a fire, okay? For the fire overall, we need oxygen. Without oxygen, the fire would suffocate. We need fuel. Pretty obvious we need fuel. What am I forgetting about? Heat. We need heat. Because without heat, the reaction simply won't take place. And then we need the chemical reaction itself that fire is. If we have trouble with any of these 4 points, like maybe the fire suffocates, the fire will go out in our smokers. So we need to maintain all 4 of these things. Some of these are easier than others. Our fuels might be pine needles. That's my go-to. It might be wood chips. Those are a reliable choice. They sell a cotton batting material for smokers at the bee stores. It does work, but I find it actually one of the more difficult ones to use. Some people use rags, old jeans. They're all decent options. It really amounts to you need something with a high surface area relative to its mass, because things like this ignite easily and burn easily. That'll come into play with the heat and everything else. Another aspect is you need it dry. Some people like to have their wood chips, slightly soaked and whatever. The issue with that is if you overshoot your target, they're going to be very difficult to keep lit. If they're on the dry side, the worst case scenario is you're going to have to keep loading your smoker more frequently. That said, I use pine needles. I keep them in a feed bag. These feed bags are effectively Tyvek, so these feed bags breathe. This stuff is crispy dry, and I can run a smoker for a half day before I have to reload it. So it's really not a moisture issue at all. Dry is fine. So we've talked about the first part of our fire tetrahedron we're going to deal with is the fuel. Dry fuel, high surface area relative to mass, like wood shavings or wood chips or pine needles. The next part of this thing we'll look at is oxygen and airflow. This is a somewhat basic smoker here. It has the fire pot, it has a bellows. The bellows has a discharge down here that blows air into this nipple here, into the bottom of the fire pot. Now, something a lot of people don't realize is there's supposed to be something here. This thing. A lot of smokers actually come with this flat packed. You're supposed to bend these legs out so it kind of creates a standoff to keep the fuel from being on the bottom of the fire pot. This one has these little screws added to it because this thing loved to flip itself over when I'd put it in this thing, and I got tired of trying to ride it, so that's how I dealt with it. What this does is it keeps the fuel off the bottom and out of this thing, out of the air inlet. As the fuel in here burns, it needs oxygen, otherwise it would go out. When you raise it up using this platform, air can get under it and up. That also greatly facilitates using the bellows because you're not blowing air directly on the fuel, you're blowing air under the fuel. And that's important for the next thing we're going to talk about, heat. Let's draw our smoker. So, fire pot, air inlet nipple thingy. Okay, there's our smoker. That's pretty good. You can tell I went to art school. In this thing, we have our air standoff down here. And that keeps the fuel above that. I should note there's a bellows back here. And we have our fuel in here. The fuel obviously goes on top of that standoff. Now here's the issue I honestly see play out the most. People, your fire needs to be down here. Because if it's down here, it's heating all the fuel above it. This is called laddering in the fire service. Fuel needs to be heated before it can actually burn. Wood doesn't burn directly. It actually decomposes into a gas, and the gas is what burns. So unless you're heating that fuel by having the fire at the bottom, this thing's going to self-extinguish. Now, this should be pretty obvious to anyone who's, lit a match. And for case in point, we'll use my handy-dandy blowtorch and light a corner on fire here. Now, we just lit that on fire, right? But because the fuel's already at the top, it doesn't have an opportunity to ladder. It's just discharging all that energy above itself. You can tell this thing's got a plastic binder in it. But if the fire was at the bottom, we'll see this ladders up because it's heating the fuel above it. This is the real reason why you need to light your smoker at the bottom. So this fire, the heat at the bottom, is heating the fuel above it. Otherwise, it's very likely it will self-extinguish. It will not stay lit on its own. Come back on fire. Alrighty. Now, another consideration, going back to the air part of this thing, is, the bellows is here to shoot air in. Oh, that's a useless marker. We'll use teal for air. The bellows is there to shoot air in, and that air goes up and through. Now, if you've packed this kind of at a medium density, with shavings you just put them in there. With pine needles you need to pack them down a little bit. This will be dense enough to where you'll get a nice coal bed at the bottom, but the air will still come through on its own to keep the fire lit. If you overpack this, if you just keep shoving in more and more fuel, eventually this becomes an impasse, and you don't have this natural chimneying effect of atmospheric air moving through the smoker. If that happens, unless you're they're maintaining the bellows the whole time, she'll go out. And this is a balance that you kind of have to discover through trial and error, especially since each fuel is going to have its own propensity to block that chimneying effect. I just thought of something else I wanted to add. What the heck was it? Oh, when I use my smoker, one of the tricks I take advantage of is I'll put the smoker on top of a tall stack near where I'm working. Usually there's some amount of airflow going on, and that just kind of helps boost my airflow through the smoker, keeping this thing lit all the time. By putting in the right amount of fuel, having your air stand off, and having the fire at the bottom of your fuel, this smoker will stay lit for hours and hours. So, quick review of our fire tetrahedron again. We need to pack the fuel, but not so tight air doesn't get in. We need a standoff to keep it off the bottom of the fire pot to help that air go in at the bottom and through it. We need the heat at the bottom. We need the fire at the bottom, so it heats the fuels above it, so those fuels will combust easily. If we light the fire at the top, it's going to be likely to self-extinguish. Also, we need a good fuel, a good dry fuel. I use pine needles. There are several fuels that will work fine. And the chemical chain reaction comes about when we have these three components together. The only time you really can block a chemical chain reaction is using something like a halon. And the halons actually interfere at the chemical level with the fire reaction process. So let's actually light a smoker. Okay, let's light a smoker the common way, the old-fashioned way, if you will. Take your smoker, empty it of whatever debris is in there. Take your stand off, put it in the bottom of the smoker. Make sure it's oriented the right way if yours is not reversible. That way you know you have that stand off to let air in at the bottom. Next, take some of your fuel, a handful if you will. Again, use pine needles. I wouldn't recommend doing this in your garage, but the light's just crazy outside today. Ignition source, in this case a little cigarette lighter, and you'll light your fuel. Now there's a reason why this isn't a great way to do this, and that is what you're about to see me do. You have to kind of have your hand in the danger zone, and then you tend the thing. The first round we're really just burning fuel off, getting as much of a ember bed as we can established. Then you actually start loading on top of it, making sure you don't punch through the fuel that's cool on top that you're adding and get your fingers into the hot bits. You could, of course, use a leather glove while doing this. And then it becomes a game of tending this smoker and running these bellows to keep that flame in there going until it's established. A lot of people would recommend doing what I'm doing right here until this whole thing lights off, which honestly is decent advice. I'm also glad this garage doesn't have a smoke detector because it would be screaming right now. Still getting it going. Take your time with this step. This kind of says if we're going to have a successful day with the smoker or not right here. And eventually, we'll have flames at the top of this thing. Now, I'll also say, as of now, this thing's going to stay lit on its own. There's enough heat built up in that fire pot. I can feel the heat coming off of it. You can actually, do you see the glow right there? It's just barely there, but there's a little bit of a glow. Whoop, there it goes. That's what we call a flashover, actually. That's where the smoke itself becomes hot enough and charged enough to actually pop. So I'm going to take my little hive tool, tap everything down in there. So now we got a good actual fire in our smoker. At this point, you top load fuel again, and you get it loaded to where you're going to take this and now use it for the next couple of hours. Admittedly, you need to kind of get the fuel inside the fire pot to close the lid on this one. That's good enough. And that'll go for several hours. So now that we went through that rigmarole, how do I light my smoker? Now, I couldn't tell you where the smoker came from. I got it used. It has a Man Lake replacement bellow on it, but it has a very shallow air inlet nipple on it. And this is pre-packed with pine needles to where if I wanted to, I could shove harder on this, but they're fairly well packed in there. And what I do to light this, I can stick my blowtorch in here. And also I have the standoff in there like I did on that one. And I can light it like this. Now the warning about doing it this way, this smoker, or rather this torch, you can have it just let propane into this, filling this with an explosive mixture of gas. I can tell the difference when this thing is just gas versus the flame. It makes a very audible difference, and I can use that to know if I'm operating safely or not. And that's how I light my smoker. The nice thing about doing it this way is it takes minimal amount of time because I can get a pretty good body of heat built up at the bottom of my fuel with this blowtorch. The biggest problem I have with this actually is I often don't do this long enough and she'll self-extinguish because I just don't have that body of heat in the bottom to keep that reaction going. Good news, all I have to do to relight it is, and she'll relight easy breezy. Now, there's one more set of things to note before we just stop discussing smokers, and that is how to transport them, how to extinguish them. When I had just one apiary, I would do the grass plug. And what this does is it suffocates the fire in the fire pot. So it preserves your fuel, it goes out, it's safe to store. It takes time for it to actually snuff out, mind you. Now, the problem I ran into is when I had multiple apiaries, I put this in the back of my truck, this blows out, and then it looks like my truck's on fire as I go down the road, which will get some interesting stares and interactions. That's something I'd like to avoid. What I do now is I actually use a 50 cal tall ammo can. Now, a standard 50 cal can's like here, you need the tall ones because the tall ones will actually fit your smoker inside. This lid has a gasket in it. So if my lit smoker goes in here, and I close and latch this thing, this is airtight. It'll snuff out the fire in there. I can also then take this can, this big heavy can, and put it in my truck toolbox and not risk destroying the smoker or catching anything there on fire. This has worked really well. I'd really recommend this. So with that, we've discussed how smokers work, lighting the smoker, keeping a smoker lit, and how to transport a smoker. I hope that's answered any and all questions you might have had about smoker use. If you have any other questions, put them in the comments. I'd love to circle back to them in future videos. Please like and subscribe. That is how my channel gets recommended to other beekeepers. That's what the algorithm actually looks at. If you followed my channel for a bit, you know I took about 2 months off of swarm season. That's in the past now. I'm looking to post every 2 weeks. That's my target. And with all of that said, I'll say good luck and happy beaking.